So I'm going to be reading a snippet from the Midnight Muse. Um, there's kind of a little joke that I have with myself because I never write sex scenes. And for this book, I finally wrote a sex scene, and this is what came out. Uh, for some context to set it up a little bit, there's this band, and their lead singer, Bryn Werner, disappeared in the woods a year ago, and the band has gotten together in the woods now. The lead guitarist, Reese, is trying to convince the others to install his fiancee, Jacqueline, as the new lead singer, and they're not having it. So he's pissed off and he storms off into the woods with a bottle of booze at night. Reese used his phone to light the way, stumbling over pine cones that cracked under his shoes. On the other side of a precipitous embankment, the creek burbled over mossy rocks. The forest was black and cool and smelled like rain. If he'd known this place was so remote, he might not have booked it. A passing glance was all he gave to the listing when Jacqueline showed it to him before he shrugged and nodded his approval. What did he care? A cabin in the woods is a cabin in the woods is a cabin in the woods. He took another swig. The trees rotated around him. The bonfire's glow was well past his line of sight. Each way he turned looked the same. There was no path, and no town nearby either. No hiking trails, just forest and more stupid forest. The cricket's repetitive song turned into a droning shrill in his ears as he went faster one way and then the next, unsure which direction would lead him back to the cabin. His feet tangled in the undergrowth. A branch whacked him in the face. This wasn't how he had anticipated the night going. The others had to realize Bryn wasn't going to magically return. It only made sense to bring in a new singer, and why not Jacqueline? He'd figured Thorne and Lou would be on board, but more than that, he'd thought Wendy would see the logic in it. She knew a good idea when she saw it. The fact she'd hesitated was what sent Reese's temper spinning, because if it had been 3-1, even with Harlow's refusal, which he'd more or less expected, she'd have been outnumbered and would have eventually given up. Without Wendy, the split was sharper, and Harlow definitely wouldn't budge. Fucking Wendy, he spat and tipped the bottle back. Jacqueline had been a little off key, too. He couldn't help thinking she'd spoiled the moment. It should have been perfect, but she wasn't, was she? Everything was riding on her performance, and she blew it. And now he was lost. He willed the trees to move aside, bring him back to the cabin. He didn't know how he'd gotten so turned around, but he supposed the booze and the mushrooms may have conspired against him. He didn't think he was completely lost, though. He was confident he would find the way back sooner or later. He really hadn't gone that far. His confidence only grew when he spotted a light through the trees. He chuckled at his good fortune and went toward it, ready to swagger back to the others and convince them to finish the orchid. But the closer he drew, the more he slowed. There was something about the light that seemed wrong, unfamiliar. It wasn't a fire ahead of him. The light was cold white. Pushing away branches, Reese discovered the light was coming from a shape, a person, skin lit by that soft, pale glow. The bottle slipped from his suddenly numb fingers as he took in the sight, disbelieving his own eyes. Recognition met with impossibility, jamming up his brainwaves. His heart seemed to stop beating, leaving him in a limbo of static that tingled through his limbs. Lying in the dirt was Bryn Werner. He gaped at her soft, round face, her naked flesh, the curve of her hip and the points of her breasts. Pristine, not a smudge on her. She was like porcelain, like moonlight. She curled her finger at him. A coy smile bent her lips. Whiskey rushed through his chest, hot as magma. Blood pulsed in his head, surged to his groin as he traced his eyes hungrily over the body he had always lusted over, the muscular abdomen, strong milky thighs. He was harder than he could ever remember being, and he drew closer and fell to his knees. It couldn't be real, but he felt her soft, cool lips when he kissed her, felt her body when he pressed against her. His pants were at his ankles, his tongue on her neck, his hands on her breasts. Ecstasy crashed through him as he thrust into her. His body tingled with it. He was out of his mind with it. He didn't even consciously recognize that all her tattoos had been wiped clean. There was no color to her, no color at all. His wordless cries tangled with hers as the trees shivered above them. He came with a shudder, collapsed onto her, heart thumping, eyes closed. He inhaled, wanting to take in the scent of her, but all he could smell was decay. His eyes opened. Hollow sockets stared up at him from a skull blackened by rot, the body he'd clutched in the throes of passion, no more than bones and cartilage, held together by scraps of skin like dirty cloth. A cluster of mushrooms sprouted from a sunken chest where the heart should be. Gagging, Reese pushed away, but his hands slipped against the rot. Watery vomit burned up his throat. He stumbled, tugging his pants, face wet. Trees tittered as the wind rattled through them, rattled through the corpse's open jaw, laughing. Reese thought his heart would explode out of his chest as he ran blindly, trying not to think what he had just spilled himself into, trying not to think what might have spilled back into him.